questions that I get asked semi-often is about changing presets so that they can behave like you want them to with a humbucker or single coil, that sort of question. And for me, well, you know, someone says, I've got to switch over from one guitar to another. One's got single coils, the other one's got humbuckers, but when I switch it over, my preset doesn't really work. That sort of thing. Now, to me, probably a little bit of a hide into nothing. If you're really trying to get two guitars to sound similar or a preset to work with two guitars and you're looking for things to be very close, then jumping from a humbucker to a single coil is not really a great way to achieve that, in my opinion. So some of the differences, typically a humbucker is going to be kind of louder going into your HX Stomp or Helix or whatever you're using, whatever modeler. It's typically going to have a higher output. That's one of the general things. And then the other thing is it's going to probably have more bass and effectively more mids, and what that will essentially sound like is, you know, less highs if you compared it to a single coil. So some people might talk about a single coil sounding ice picky, and on the flip side you might think a humbucker kind of sounds honky in comparison. So I looked at this article, I think someone's linked me to it before, from Presonus, and it's looking at kind of the differences in EQ curves between a typical single coil and a typical humbucker. Now, there's no real hard and fast rule here. Obviously every humbucker and pickup single coil is going to have a different sound signature. You could do this exercise yourself if you really wanted to. I guess you could send like a sine wave through your pickup or something. What could you do? Yeah, so if you took like an A44, you know, like on some tuners you can play 440 Hertz. If you recorded playing that sound through a certain preset or clean, and then did the same thing through a humbucker, you could compare those signatures. Maybe I'll try and do that. I don't know, we'll see if I get time. Then you could compare the signatures side by side and say, well, what do I need to add to this or subtract from this to get similarity? So probably the humbucker will have to be slightly quieter, and you might have to either cut the bass and the mids and boost the highs or something like that. So I wanted to just do something like that in this video. So I've taken my normal Eric Lead preset, and instead of going into the actual amp model and making adjustments there, because that is what I would typically do, but maybe if I wanted to preserve presets and snapshots and stuff, maybe that wouldn't be the best thing to do. I've gone and I've put some EQ blocks at the start, so I'll just show you what I'm attempting, and maybe you could experiment with this yourself. I guess the other thing is to say that maybe your favourite player is a humbucker player and you're a single coil player, or maybe your favourite player plays single coils all the time, but you're a humbucker guy and you want to try their presets and you're thinking, this is a bit frustrating. So this is maybe a video that might be slightly interesting for you, or maybe it won't be. But so this is the example of the tone without any EQ at the front end. And maybe compared to like the single coil version of that tone, that's probably a little bit darker, a little bit honkier, and so when I go to play this preset, I might think, that doesn't sound quite like how I wanted it to do. So what I've done is, the first block I've got here is a low-high shelf, and I've taken that low frequency down to 150 Hertz. So all of this is going to be happening ahead of the amp block and ahead of the compressor, ahead of the overdrive. We're basically wanting to EQ things as close to hitting the front of HX Stomp as we can. So think about it as putting an EQ pedal between your guitar and your amp, and we're trying to kind of shape those frequencies. So I'm using the bridge pickup here, and even that might be slightly honky. So I've got at the very front of this a low-high shelf, and I'm taking the 150 Hertz, I'm shelving below that by -5 dB. This is kind of the thumpier frequencies, and then what I'm also doing is kind of having a high shelf at the very high end at 7 kilohertz here, and that is where we are not being affected yet. So let me just show you what we could do there. So I might bring that down even, so you'll get a sense for what this is doing, hopefully. So here's without. So we're actually kind of introducing a bit more clarity. So you could even take that high frequency down a bit lower to sort of 2 kilohertz, maybe even 1 kilohertz. And this shaping is fairly subtle, I think. So we're kind of subtly brightening it up a bit. Then another thing you might want to try is sticking a 10-band graphic EQ in there. And what I was using this for was to shelve out some of the mids. So minus 2 dB at the 250 Hz range, minus 5 dB at the 500 Hz range, and then minus 2.9 at the 1 kHz range. And then starting to boost things in the highs again. So plus 2 at 2 kHz, plus 2 at the 4 kHz, and plus 4 at the 8 kHz. And again, that probably sounds and looks a little bit extreme. So it's not really changing the character of the kind of overall tone too much, but you're kind of starting to bring in a bit more clarity and maybe get rid of some of that honkiness that might not be what you're looking for. And the other thing that I was doing was taking the gain down on this low-high shelf a little bit, because, as I said earlier, a humbucker is generally going to have slightly lower output than a single coil, so you'll probably be driving the front of the amp slightly less hard if you were playing single coils than if you were playing humbuckers. So I'm just taking the level down a little bit, and that is also darkening things up a little bit too. So I think it's making quite a big difference in the amount of kind of clarity to the preset. So maybe give that a little try, and you could increase that high gain if you want to on the high shelf. Just experiment, I think, with different bits and pieces. For the EQ in front of your normal kind of preset, if you've got enough blocks to try this, I think that's worth experimenting with. Let me know if you've got other tricks that you like to use. Typically, I would go into the amp block and maybe bring down mids as well, and bring up presence and treble if I was using humbuckers instead of single coils, as well as maybe taking down gain in general. But I think these EQ blocks at the front of the chain might be a slightly easier way to achieve a similar thing, and without changing the actual nature of the gain stages as much, if that makes sense. Catch you in another video soon, and cheers.